A black teenager's best friend, a loyal dog named Justice, was more than a pet. He was family, a furry shadow of joy in a quiet suburban neighborhood. One cruel act, a senseless killing by a racist cop, fueled by petty malice, shattered that bond in a young boy's world. The officer thought it was just a dog, an insignificant life. He never imagined that this single gunshot would ignite a firestorm of grief and outrage, uniting an entire town and turning their sorrow into an unstoppable demand for reckoning. Viewers, welcome. We're honored you're here for a story that grips the heart and challenges our deepest sense of fairness. What you're about to witness explores the profound bond between a boy and his dog, and the devastating ripple effects when that bond is cruelly severed by an act of senseless authority. If stories that delve into community, consequence, and the fight for what's right speak to you, consider subscribing and joining our daily conversations. Your presence here helps amplify these vital narratives. Thank you. 15-year-old Jamal Hayes lived for two things: the thrumming bass line of his favorite hip-hop tracks and the unwavering, joyous companionship of his dog, Justice. Justice wasn't a purebred champion or a meticulously trained show dog. He was a scruffy, lovable mutt, a joyful explosion of brindle fur, mismatched ears, and a tail that wagged with the relentless optimism of a metronome set to allegro. Jamal had found him a year ago, abandoned and shivering in a rain-soaked box behind the local supermarket. He'd coaxed the terrified puppy out with half a sandwich and a gentle voice, and from that moment on, they were inseparable. Justice was more than a pet. He was Jamal's confidant, his shadow, his four-legged antidote to the anxieties of adolescence and the subtle, sometimes not so subtle, racial currents that ran beneath the placid surface of their suburban town, Meadowbrook. Meadowbrook prided itself on its manicured lawns, its excellent school district, and its 4th of July parades. It was the kind of town where people smiled and waved, where bake sales funded the Little League, and where problems, especially those concerning race or inequality, were generally swept under the pristine green carpet of civic politeness. Jamal's family, the Hayeses, were one of a handful of black families in their predominantly white neighborhood. His parents, both educators, had moved to Meadowbrook for the schools and the promise of a safe, nurturing environment for Jamal and his younger sister, Maya. They navigated the town's social landscape with a careful grace, aware of the unspoken rules, the subtle discomforts, the constant need to be just a little bit better, a little bit more patient, to counteract the low hum of underlying bias. Jamal was a good kid, bright, artistic, with a talent for digital animation that was already turning heads in his art class. He was quiet, introspective, more comfortable expressing himself through his drawings or the intricate beats he created on his laptop than through boisterous pronouncements. Justice was his perfect counterpoint, exuberant, endlessly affectionate, a furry embodiment of unconditional love. Every afternoon, after school, Jamal and Justice would explore the network of wooded trails that bordered their neighborhood, Justice bounding ahead, nose to the ground, then circling back to nudge Jamal's hand, his happy panting a familiar soundtrack to their adventures. These walks were sacred, a time when Jamal felt completely himself, completely at ease, the weight of the world and its judgments momentarily lifted. The hidden power in this unfolding tragedy wouldn't be a person of high status or a sudden revelation of wealth. It would be the collective conscience of a town, an entity often dormant, lulled by comfort and conformity, but capable of being roused to ferocious life by an act so egregious, so profoundly unjust, that it shattered the carefully constructed facade of suburban peace. It would be the power of shared grief, of parental outrage, of a community finally forced to confront the darkness it had long preferred to ignore, and it would be ignited by the love for a boy and his dog. Officer Frank Ramsey was a sour note in Meadowbrook's otherwise harmonious composition. He was a man who seemed to derive a grim satisfaction from wielding his authority, particularly over those he perceived as other or disrespectful. He was known for his short temper, his condescending attitude, and his tendency to escalate minor situations. He'd had several citizen complaints filed against him over the years, for rudeness, for overly aggressive traffic stops, but they had always been quietly handled, smoothed over by a police department keen to maintain its image. Ramsey had a particular dislike for teenagers, whom he viewed as inherently problematic, and he seemed to reserve a special level of disdain for Jamal, perhaps because Jamal, with his quiet demeanor and his hip-hop music, didn't fit Ramsey's narrow definition of a good Meadowbrook kid. He'd hassled Jamal a few times before for skateboarding too close to the sidewalk, for his music being too loud in his own backyard, petty encounters that left Jamal feeling singled out and resentful. The Hayeses lived on a quiet cul-de-sac, their modest, well-kept home backing onto a stretch of unfenced woodland that eventually led to the town's nature preserve. It was a warm, late spring afternoon. Jamal was in his backyard, tossing a well-chewed tennis ball for Justice. The windows were open, and the sounds of his latest beat-making project, a mellow, lo-fi instrumental, drifted out into the air. Justice, a blur of happy energy, would retrieve the ball, his whole body wiggling with delight, and drop it at Jamal's feet, eager for the next throw. It was a scene of idyllic innocence, a snapshot of pure, unadulterated joy. But that idyllic scene was about to be violently, irrevocably shattered. Officer Ramsey's patrol car, moving slowly, almost predatorily, down the street, paused at the end of the Hayeses' driveway. He wasn't responding to a call. He was just watching, his gaze fixed on Jamal and Justice, a flicker of something cold and unpleasant in his eyes. The quiet joy in the Hayeses' backyard, it seemed, was an affront to Officer Ramsey's sensibilities. He cut his engine, the sudden silence a heavy, ominous blanket. The stage was set not for an arrest or even a citation, but for an act of cruelty so profound it would tear the heart out of a boy and awaken the sleeping conscience of an entire town. The idyllic afternoon in Jamal Hayes's backyard took a sinister turn the moment Officer Frank Ramsey stepped out of his patrol car. The joyous barks of Justice, the rhythmic thump of the lo-fi beat drifting from Jamal's open window, the gentle thud of the tennis ball, all these innocent sounds seemed to magnify under the sudden, oppressive weight of Ramsey's presence. He didn't approach the front door. Instead, he walked with a deliberate, almost insolent slowness around the side of the house, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. His eyes narrowed as he surveyed the scene in the backyard. Jamal, mid-throw, froze. Justice, sensing the shift in his boy's demeanor and the approach of a stranger, stopped his playful chase, trotted back to Jamal's side, and let out a low, questioning woof. He wasn't aggressive, merely alert, his head cocked, his brindle body tensed. "Afternoon, Jamal," Ramsey called out, his voice devoid of any warmth, heavy with a disapproval that felt entirely out of place. "Quite the racket you're making back here, disturbing the peace, wouldn't you say?" Jamal felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. This was Ramsey's usual tactic: find a flimsy pretext, assert authority, make him feel small. "No, sir, Officer Ramsey," Jamal replied, his voice polite but firm. "We're just playing in my own yard. The music isn't loud." "Sounds loud to me," Ramsey retorted, taking a few more steps, positioning himself just outside the low chain-link fence that separated the Hayeses' property from the unkempt verge of the woods. His gaze flickered from Jamal to Justice, lingering on the dog with an expression that made Jamal profoundly uneasy. "That your dog?" "Yes, sir." "This is Justice." Jamal instinctively put a hand on Justice's head, a gesture of both affection and protection. Justice, sensing his boy's tension, pressed closer, emitting another soft, low growl, not of aggression but of loyalty, of protectiveness. "Justice, huh?" Ramsey sneered, a small, unpleasant smile playing on his lips. "He looks more like a menace to me. You got him licensed? Rabies shots up to date?" "Yes, sir. All his tags are on his collar. He's a good dog. He wouldn't hurt anyone." Jamal's voice was stronger now, a note of defensiveness creeping in. He hated the way Ramsey was looking at Justice, as if the dog were vermin. "All dogs can turn," Ramsey said dismissively. "Especially mutts like that. You should keep him leashed, even in your own yard. Town ordinance, public safety." This was a blatant lie. Meadowbrook had a leash law for public spaces, but not for private fenced property, and the Hayes' backyard, while not fully enclosed by a high fence, was clearly their private domain. Jamal knew this. "Sir, this is my property. He's allowed to be off-leash here." Ramsey's eyes narrowed. He didn't like being contradicted, especially by a teenager, especially by Jamal. "Are you arguing with me, boy, telling me how to do my job?" He took another step closer to the fence line, his posture becoming more aggressive. Justice, reacting to the officer's escalating tone and Jamal's rising distress, barked, a sharp, clear warning bark. He moved slightly in front of Jamal, positioning himself as a furry, four-legged shield. He didn't lunge, didn't snarl, didn't show his teeth. It was the bark of a loyal companion sensing a threat to his beloved human. "See?" Ramsey spat, his face flushing an ugly red. "Aggressive animal, uncontrolled. That dog is a danger." "No, he's not," Jamal cried out, his voice trembling now. "He's just protecting me. You're scaring him. You're scaring me." "I'm scaring you?" Ramsey scoffed, his hand now moving definitively towards his holstered firearm. "That dog is exhibiting threatening behavior. I have a duty to neutralize any threat to public safety and to myself." Events then unfolded with horrifying, gut-wrenching speed. Before Jamal could plead further, before he could pull Justice back, before he could even fully process the officer's menacing words, Ramsey drew his service weapon. There was no attempt to use pepper spray, no call for animal control, no warning shot. Just the cold, hard glint of steel in the afternoon sun. "Justice, no!" Jamal screamed, lunging for his dog. But it was too late. The deafening crack of a gunshot shattered the suburban quiet, a sound so violent, so out of place, it seemed to rip a hole in the very fabric of the afternoon. Justice yelped, a high-pitched cry of pain and surprise, and stumbled, his brindle legs buckling beneath him. He looked at Jamal, his beautiful, intelligent eyes wide with confusion and a dawning, unbearable agony. Then he collapsed onto the soft green grass, a dark stain blooming rapidly on his side. Jamal fell to his knees beside his dog, his mind reeling, a strangled sob tearing from his throat. "Justice! Oh, God, Justice!" He reached for his friend, his hands instantly slick with warm blood. Justice whined softly, licked Jamal's hand once, a final desperate act of love, and then his body went limp. His bright, loving eyes glazed over. Officer Ramsey stood on the other side of the fence, his gun still pointed, his face a mask of grim, almost satisfied determination. "Threat neutralized," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion, any remorse. He holstered his weapon. "Should have kept that animal under control, son. This is on you." Jamal didn't hear him. He was cradling Justice's lifeless head in his lap, his body racked with uncontrollable sobs, his tears mingling with the blood matting his beloved dog's fur. The music from his open window, a gentle, soulful beat he'd been so proud of just moments before, now seemed like a cruel, mocking dirge. The tennis ball lay forgotten a few feet away, a bright yellow sphere in a world that had suddenly, irrevocably, turned to ash. The gunshot, the single brutal act of a man consumed by hate and armed with a badge, hadn't just killed a dog. It had murdered a part of Jamal's soul and ignited a fuse that would soon set the entire town of Meadowbrook ablaze. The gunshot that killed Justice echoed through the quiet cul-de-sac with the brutal finality of a death knell. Windows slid open, doors creaked. Neighbors, drawn by the ungodly sound, peered out, their faces etched with alarm and disbelief. What they saw was a scene of unimaginable horror. Young Jamal Hayes, kneeling on his lawn, his shoulders shaking with inconsolable grief, cradling the bleeding, lifeless body of his beloved dog. And standing just beyond the fence line, a chilling tableau of official indifference, was Officer Frank Ramsey, his service weapon now holstered, his expression impassive, almost smug. Jamal's mother, Sarah Hayes, was the first to reach him. She'd been in the kitchen preparing dinner when the shot rang out. Her heart had leaped into her throat. She burst out the back door, her eyes frantically scanning the yard. And then she saw him, her son, and Justice. A strangled cry escaped her lips. "Jamal, oh my baby, what happened?" She rushed to his side, her mind struggling to comprehend the scene. Ramsey, hearing her approach, turned. "Ma'am," he began, his tone officious, "your son's dog was acting aggressively. It charged me. I was forced to defend myself." Sarah Hayes, a woman known for her gentle demeanor and quiet strength, looked up at Ramsey, her eyes blazing with a mother's fury and a profound, gathering storm of outrage. "Charged you?" she repeated, her voice trembling but dangerously low. "He was in his own yard, Officer Ramsey, with my son. Justice wouldn't hurt a fly. He was a puppy, a gentle soul. You shot him in our yard in front of my child." By now, other neighbors were emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Mr. Henderson, the elderly man from across the street who often chatted with Jamal about his gardening, looked on, his face pale with shock. Mrs. DeLuca from next door, who always had a treat for Justice when he and Jamal passed by on their walks, covered her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. They saw Jamal, inconsolable. They saw the dead dog, and they saw Officer Ramsey standing there, offering a version of events that, to anyone who knew Justice, to anyone who had witnessed his gentle nature, sounded like a grotesque lie. Jamal's father, David Hayes, a history teacher at the local high school, arrived home from a late faculty meeting just as the first Meadowbrook police supervisor, Sergeant Miller, pulled up. His own lights flashing, David took in the scene, his sobbing son, his devastated wife, the lifeless form of their family pet, and Officer Ramsey standing there with a defensive glint in his eye. And a cold, terrible understanding washed over him. He'd had his own quiet run-ins with Ramsey's abrasive attitude. He knew the man's reputation. "What in God's name happened here, Ramsey?" Sergeant Miller demanded, his voice tight with a mixture of professional concern and personal dismay. He knew the Hayes family. He knew Jamal. He'd even met Justice on a few occasions during community policing events. Ramsey launched into his rehearsed justification. "The dog was out of control, Sarge. Barking, growling, charged right at me. I had no choice. Officer safety, public safety. He was playing fetch in his own yard," Jamal finally choked out, lifting his tear-streaked face. "He barked because you were yelling. You scared him. You just shot him." The raw anguish in the boy's voice was a palpable thing, cutting through the official jargon. Sergeant Miller looked from Ramsey's stony face to Jamal's devastated one. then to the growing crowd of visibly shaken neighbors. He could sense the narrative Ramsay was trying to spin, and he could also sense the profound disbelief rippling through the onlookers. Mrs. DeLuca stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Officer Ramsay, I saw part of it from my window. Justice wasn't charging, he was standing by Jamal. He barked, yes, but you were advancing, you were shouting. It didn't look like he was attacking." Another neighbor, Mr. Chen, who lived 2 doors down, added, "My kids play with Justice all the time. He's the gentlest dog. This doesn't make any sense." The seeds of doubt against Ramsay's official story were being sown, watered by the community's first-hand knowledge of the dog and the boy. The hidden power of shared experience and neighborly connection was beginning to stir. Ramsay, however, doubled down. "With all due respect, civilians don't understand the split-second decisions we have to make. The animal was a threat. I acted accordingly." His arrogance, even in the face of gathering dissent, was astounding. Sergeant Miller, a veteran officer with a more nuanced understanding of community relations, looked increasingly troubled. He instructed another arriving officer to take statements from everyone present. He knelt beside Jamal, his voice softer. "Jamal, son, I am so incredibly sorry about Justice. This is a terrible thing." But Jamal was beyond an officer's platitudes. His world had been shattered. The trust he might have once had in the uniform was gone, replaced by a burning sense of injustice and a grief so profound it felt like a physical wound. His parents, while trying to comfort their son, were also struggling with their own shock and a rising tide of anger. This wasn't just about a dead dog. This was about an officer of the law, a man sworn to protect, who had brought violence and terror into their sanctuary, who had traumatized their child, and who was now trying to lie his way out of it. As the initial shock began to wear off, replaced by a cold, hard fury, the Hayes family made a decision. They would not let this be swept under the rug. They would not let Officer Ramsay's version of events stand unchallenged. They would demand accountability. They would demand justice for justice. Little did they, or Officer Ramsay, or even Sergeant Miller, realize that this single tragic gunshot in a quiet suburban backyard was about to ignite a firestorm that would consume the carefully cultivated peace of Meadowbrook and expose the simmering tensions that lay just beneath its surface. The eruption was coming, not in a wave of violence, but in a groundswell of collective grief and righteous anger that would prove more powerful than any single officer's authority. The news of Justice's killing and Officer Ramsay's involvement spread through Meadowbrook with the speed of a social media wildfire. It wasn't just the Hayes family and their immediate neighbors who were affected. It was the entire community. Nearly everyone in the tight-knit town knew Jamal, or his parents, or had at some point encountered the friendly, tail-wagging Justice on his walks. The story resonated deeply, tapping into a primal sense of injustice and a shared love for animals that transcended age, race, and social standing. Jamal's friends, teenagers who had grown up with him, were among the first to react. They were heartbroken for their friend, but also deeply, personally outraged. They had played with Justice, thrown sticks for him, seen the profound bond he shared with Jamal. Ramsay's official narrative that Justice was an aggressive, uncontrolled animal was not just unbelievable to them, it was a slander against a creature they knew to be gentle and loving. They started a simple hashtag, Justice for Justice. It began as a trickle on local Instagram and Facebook feeds, accompanied by pictures of Jamal and Justice, happy memories now tinged with an unbearable sadness. But it quickly became a torrent. Parents hearing the story from their children or from their neighbors were horrified. Many had pets of their own. They understood the depth of the human-animal bond. The thought of an officer shooting a dog in its own backyard, in front of a child, without any clear and present danger, was unconscionable. Mrs. DeLuca, who had offered her initial tentative witness statement, found her courage solidifying. She spoke to other neighbors, compared notes, her voice gaining strength as she realized she wasn't alone in her assessment of Ramsey's aggression. The Meadowbrook Online Community Forum, usually a placid space for discussing lost cats and upcoming bake sales, exploded. Officer Ramsey's official report, which was eventually leaked, likely by a sympathetic clerk within the PD who was also a dog lover, was dissected, analyzed, and torn apart. Residents pointed out inconsistencies, questioned his judgment, and overwhelmingly condemned his actions. The few voices that tried to defend Ramsey, or to suggest that people should wait for all the facts, were quickly drowned out by a chorus of disbelief and anger. The hidden power of the community was awakening, and it was taking a form that the town's leadership and Officer Ramsey were entirely unprepared for. It wasn't violent, not at first. It was a quiet, persistent, and rapidly growing wave of dissent. People started tying blue ribbons, Justice's favorite color, the color of his collar, to their mailboxes, their trees, the lampposts along Main Street. The local animal shelter where Jamal had volunteered put up a large sign, "We stand with Jamal, justice for justice." Donations poured in Justice's name. The Meadowbrook Town Council, which usually dealt with zoning ordinances and budget approvals, suddenly found itself at the epicenter of a crisis. Their phone lines were jammed. Their email inboxes overflowed. At the next scheduled town council meeting, a week after the shooting, the normally sparsely attended event was packed to overflowing. Residents, many wearing blue ribbons, lined up for hours to speak during the public comment period. Sarah and David Hayes, though still mired in their own grief, spoke with quiet, compelling dignity. David, the history teacher, drew parallels to other abuses of power, his voice resonating with a scholar's precision and a father's pain. Sarah, her voice thick with emotion but her resolve clear, spoke of the trauma inflicted on her son, of the violation of their home, of the love they had for justice. "This was not an act of public safety, council members," she stated, her gaze sweeping across their increasingly uncomfortable faces. "This was an act of cruelty, an abuse of authority, by an officer who has a documented history of aggressive behavior, and we demand accountability." Then Jamal himself, encouraged by his parents and supported by a group of his friends, stepped up to the podium. He was trembling, his voice barely a whisper at first, but he clutched a framed photo of Justice. "He was my best friend," Jamal said, his voice cracking. He never hurt anyone. Officer Ramsey, he didn't have to shoot him. He hated him. He hated us." The raw, unfiltered grief of a 15-year-old boy accusing a police officer of hate landed in the council chamber with the force of a physical blow. There wasn't a dry eye in the house. The eruption was no longer just online or in hushed neighborhood conversations. It was public, it was vocal, and it was unified. Teachers, doctors, small business owners, retirees, parents, teenagers, a cross-section of Meadowbrook, a community that rarely agreed on anything unanimously, was united in its demand for action against Officer Ramsey. The police chief, a man named Henderson, no relation to the DA from the previous story, who had initially issued a terse statement about an ongoing internal investigation, found himself under siege. His attempts to downplay the incident, to defend Ramsey's split-second decision, were met with derision and open hostility. The carefully maintained facade of Meadowbrook's tranquility had been shattered, and the pieces were sharp, angry, and demanding to be heard. The entire town had indeed erupted, not in flames, but in a righteous fury that promised a long, hard fight for the memory of a boy's best friend. The Meadowbrook Town Council chamber, usually a somnolent venue for bureaucratic proceedings, crackled with an electric tension. The testimony of Jamal Hayes, his voice raw with grief as he clutched the photo of Justice, had acted as a lightning rod, galvanizing the already simmering outrage into a palpable force. One by one, residents stepped up to the microphone, their voices a chorus of sorrow, anger, and disbelief. Mrs. Gable, a respected retired librarian, spoke of Justice's gentle nature, how he'd patiently allowed toddlers to pat his head during park outings. Mr. Rodriguez, owner of the local hardware store, recounted how Officer Ramsey had unjustly ticketed his son for loitering outside his own shop. A pattern began to emerge, not just of Ramsey's aggression on that fateful afternoon, but of a history of petty tyrannies, of biased enforcement, of a man who seemed to abuse his badge with impunity. The town council members, visibly shaken by the outpouring, exchanged nervous glances. They were accustomed to debates about potholes and property taxes, not to accusations of police brutality and demands for an officer's dismissal. Police Chief Henderson, seated stoically beside them, looked increasingly beleaguered as the public condemnation mounted. His standard deflections, internal investigation pending, officer acted within protocol, respect the process, were met with jeers and shouts of resign and fire Ramsey now. The Justice for Justice movement gained national traction. Animal rights organizations, alerted by the viral posts, issued statements condemning the shooting. Civil rights groups, recognizing the racial undertones of Ramsey's long-standing harassment of Jamal and other minority residents, began to monitor the situation. Meadowbrook, the sleepy suburban town, was suddenly under a harsh, unwelcome spotlight. Under immense pressure, the town council convened an emergency closed session. The result, announced a day later, was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but signaled a significant shift. Officer Frank Ramsey was placed on administrative leave, pending the outcome of not just an internal affairs investigation, but also an independent review to be conducted by the county sheriff's department, an outside agency. This was a small victory for the Hayes family and their supporters, but they knew it wasn't enough. Administrative leave is not accountability, David Hayes stated at a quickly organized press conference on his front lawn, with Jamal and a now even larger group of supporters behind him. The independent investigation by the county sheriff's department began, and it was far more thorough than any internal review Meadowbrook PD was likely to conduct. Detectives interviewed every witness, meticulously reviewed Ramsey's personnel file, unearthing a troubling number of previously dismissed or lightly disciplined complaints, and scrutinized the forensic evidence from the scene. Crucially, they discovered that Officer Ramsey's body-worn camera, which should have been activated during any citizen interaction, had been inadvertently turned off just moments before he approached the Hayes' property, and was only reactivated after Justice had been shot. This malfunction, in light of Ramsey's history and the eyewitness accounts, cast an even darker shadow of suspicion over his official report. While the official investigations proceeded, the citizens of Meadowbrook took matters into their own hands. They organized peaceful protests outside the police station and town hall, their numbers growing with each passing week. A vigil for justice drew hundreds to the park, where candles flickered in memory of the slain dog, and speakers shared stories of his gentle spirit. Local businesses put up "We Support the Hayes Family" signs. The Meadowbrook High School Student Council, led by Jamal's friends, organized a fundraiser that collected thousands of dollars for a legal fund for the Hayes family, should they choose to pursue civil action, and for a donation to a no-kill animal shelter in Justice's name. The sustained public pressure was relentless. Chief Henderson, facing a vote of no confidence from his own rank and file, many of whom were also pet owners and privately appalled by Ramsey's actions, and an ultimatum from the town council, finally tendered his resignation. The council appointed an interim chief from an outside municipality, a woman with a strong reputation for reform and community engagement. The climax of the official proceedings came nearly 3 months after Justice's death. The county sheriff's investigation concluded that Officer Ramsey had violated multiple departmental policies, including those regarding the use of deadly force, interaction with minors, and the mandatory use of body-worn cameras. The report cited a pattern of behavior indicating a disregard for departmental procedure and an unacceptable propensity for escalation. While the investigators stopped short of recommending criminal charges due to the complexities of proving criminal intent in officer-involved shootings under existing state law, the findings were a damning indictment of Ramsey's conduct. Faced with this irrefutable report and the certainty of a protracted and costly legal battle if they tried to reinstate him, the town of Meadowbrook officially terminated Frank Ramsey's employment as a police officer. The announcement was met with a mixture of solemn relief and continued determination from the Hayes family and their supporters. Ramsey was gone, but the fight for broader systemic change within their town's police force and for laws that offered greater protection to animals and greater accountability for officers was just beginning. The town, once complacent, had found its voice, a collective roar that had started with the heartbreaking yelp of a dying dog and the anguished cry of a boy who loved him. The termination of Officer Frank Ramsey was a watershed moment for Meadowbrook, but it was not an end, rather a beginning of a deeper reckoning. The raw wound of Justice's killing had exposed underlying fractures within the community, issues of race, power, and police accountability that had long been papered over by suburban pleasantries. The Hayes family, thrust into an unwelcome spotlight, handled their grief and their newfound role as catalysts for change with remarkable grace and fortitude. Jamal, though forever scarred by the trauma of witnessing his best friend's violent death, found a path through his pain. He channeled his artistic talents into creating a powerful digital animation depicting his bond with justice and the tragedy of his loss. The animation, shared online, went viral, touching hearts far beyond Meadowbrook and becoming a poignant visual anthem for the Justice for Justice movement. He also began volunteering more intensely at the local animal shelter, finding solace in caring for other abandoned and vulnerable creatures. His quiet resilience inspired his peers and many adults in the community. The town council, under the guidance of the new interim police chief, Dr. Alana Reeves, embarked on a series of significant reforms. Dr. Reeves, a firm believer in community policing and de-escalation, mandated comprehensive retraining for all officers in implicit bias, crisis intervention, and animal encounters. Body camera policies were revamped with stricter activation protocols and random audits by a newly formed civilian oversight board. The town even passed Justice's Law, a local ordinance strengthening penalties for the unjustifiable killing or injury of domestic animals and providing funding for better training for officers in handling animal-related calls.